in-person of Abusulayman Center for Global Islamic Studies. And we are very happy to have Dr. Morris Rossabi with us today. Let me introduce him. Doesn't require an introduction, but nevertheless, let me try. Morris Rossabi has a PhD from Columbia University, was born in Alexandria, Egypt, and currently teaches Chinese and Mongolian history at the City University of New York and Columbia University. He's the author and editor of 28 books, including Kublai Khan, Modern Mongolia, Voyager from Xanadu or Kanadu? Xanadu, China and the Uyghurs, from Yuan to modern China and Mongolia. The writings of Morris Rossabi and a history of China, as well as over 100 book chapters and articles. He has collaborated on catalogs for art exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. He has traveled extensively and lectured in the Middle East, China, Japan, Korea, Central Asia, and Mongolia. The National Mongolian University awarded him an honorary doctorate in 2009. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mongolia awarded him a certificate of merit in 2020. Today, Dr. Rossabi will speak to us on Hui and Uyghur in modern China, two Muslim groups. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Virginia. I don't think my hosts know that my first professional position was assistant professor of history at Mary Washington College here in Fredericksburg, Virginia, many years ago. And at that time, it was only female students, and the women were only allowed to wear dresses or skirts. There was no possibility of wearing pants or anything, pantsuits or anything like that in those days. And I had to wear a jacket and tie at every lecture, every presentation that I made. So it was a different world. My wife got a job at Spotsylvania County, Virginia, and she had had a very academic secondary school education. And here she was in a time in Spotsylvania when there was no special education. So she was teaching youngsters of a broad range and some who had real emotional handicaps. So we really learned a tremendous amount in our 3 years here. It was quite an experience for us. And so I've always liked Virginia. I'm very fond of Virginia in many ways. We had the beginning of our marriage, and so it's particularly nice to be here. What I'm going to be talking about is somewhat controversial, the position of the Hui and the Uyghurs in contemporary China. And in part, it's because of present political circumstances. But I want to go back a little bit and talk about, for a few minutes, about how Islamic communities wound up in China. I remember a few years ago, 6, 7 years ago, meeting with a head of a foundation in New York, and I used the word Uyghur. He said, "What is that? What is that all about?" I don't think that would be the case today. I think most people would know who the Uyghurs are. But to start in background, why are there Muslims in China, so far away from the centers of the Islamic world in many ways? Well, for one thing, starting around the 7th century, almost immediately after the rise of Islam, Persians and Arabs came to China, mostly merchants who wanted to trade for Chinese silk. China had a monopoly on silk and produced the best quality silk. So they came, bought the silk, and brought with them all sorts of products from Iran and the Arab world. The Chinese were very tolerant. There was no discrimination against foreigners during that period, the 7th and 8th centuries. And in fact, these Muslims were served as interpreters and translators for the Chinese court. And so they were even more important. And the result was that they came by two routes. They came along the Silk Roads through what's on here, the Xinjiang, which is a real cornerstone of Eurasia. It's out here in this area over here now, Uyghur Autonomous Region of Xinjiang. These oases, Kashgar, not Urumqi, but Kashgar in those days was an important center for trade. And as I'll point out, the Chinese in their current Belt and Road Initiative are very, very interested in stability and peace in this area. That's why they've adopted rather draconian, difficult policies. The inhabitants of that area are mostly non-Han people. Han refers to the ethnic Chinese, and non-Han people inhabit this area, mostly Muslim. There are some remnants of Buddhists, but mostly they're Buddhist. Everything was fine in the relationships between the Muslims and the Chinese until the 13th century. At that point, the Mongols invaded and conquered China, and they needed help in ruling China, particularly in setting up a tax system, setting up a budget. They recruited Muslims as financial commissioners and as tax collectors. Muslims, of course, realized that they would get greater credit by having an increase in the tax revenue. Chinese didn't like it. And so you begin to get a kind of undercurrent of hostility between the Chinese and the Muslim community in China. Up until that time, you have, you have items like this, horses being used in the Silk Road trade, very important. And the result is that they became important in Chinese art as well. This is tricolored ceramic horse of the 7th and 8th century. Oftentimes, the Chinese were not particularly adept and skillful at dealing with horses. And so they used the Muslims to really take charge of the horse administration of the empire. Without the Muslims, there would have been not much of a cavalry for China. Camels, again, Chinese were not terrific with in dealing with camels. The Muslim community was, and so again, they were quite valuable to the Chinese. Xinjiang, this area became a transmitter, became a center of culture back and forth between the Middle East, India, and China. Buddhism through the Silk Road, via Xinjiang, via this northwestern Chinese province. That began to falter, began to erode with the Mongol period. There began to be greater hostility towards the Muslim community. When the Mongols left in the late 14th century, things began to improve somewhat, and through the Ming Dynasty, Muslims were again had a favorable relationship with the Chinese, and one particular Muslim, a Chinese Muslim, led the greatest naval expedition in world history up until that time. A man who left in 1405 on 7 naval expeditions, greatest naval expeditions in world history up until that time, and reached all the way to the east coast of Africa. So Muslims were entrusted with very important responsibilities by the Chinese. And things were going very, very well. And as a result, some Chinese began to convert to Islam. Those Chinese came to be known as Hui, H-U-I, and that's one of the aspects of this talk. The Hui are one group, the Uyghurs are another Muslim group. The Hui are ethnically Chinese. They just believe in Islam. Because there was relative freedom in that time period, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, the Hui began writing about Islam. For the first time, we have descriptions of the theology of Islam, the main principles of Islam, in something called the Han Kitab, the Han Kitab. And what they tried to do, basically, was to try to get themselves even more accepted in Chinese civilization. That what they did was show that Islam and Confucianism were compatible. There was no threat from the Islamic world to Confucianism. And that way they thought they could ingratiate themselves to the Chinese community. And that worked till the 18th century. In the 18th century, let me just show you a little bit what happened in the 18th century. Darn it. Okay. In the 18th century, the Xinjiang was composed of a whole series of different Turkic groups. And China in the 18th century, in the 1750s, expanded into that area. It expanded for a variety of reasons. It was threatened by a Mongol group in Xinjiang. In fighting the Mongol group, they also overwhelmed and occupied the Turkic Islamic groups. And so by 1760, China had added Xinjiang for the first time in history. Chinese communists will say that Xinjiang has always been part of China from the 1st century AD. That is a mistake. That is ahistorical. It's in the 18th century that Xinjiang becomes part of China. That adds it now constitutes 1/6 of the total territory of China and has fantastic resources, as I'll try to point out. The Chinese government, or the dynasty government, the Qing dynasty government in the 18th century, recognized that the vast majority of the population of Xinjiang was Muslim and Turkic. And so they advised the officials who went out there, the Chinese officials who went out there, not to antagonize the local people, to allow them to practice their form of Islam, to allow them to build mosques, to allow them to print the Quran. And on top of that, not allow Chinese merchants to take advantage of the Islamic community. The problem was it proved to be difficult to get Chinese officials to go out to this area. They thought of it as a backwater. They felt that it was not a way to advance their careers. Nobody would notice them in Xinjiang. Nobody in Beijing would notice them. And so they would be stuck in Xinjiang forever from their standpoint. So it was difficult to get qualified, competent people. And the result was that the people who were sent out there, some of them were people who had been accused of and found to be corrupt in the central part of China. They were the only ones that would go out there. And so they did not abide by the rules that were set up by the government. They prohibited, in some cases, the building of mosques. They prohibited the printing of the Quran, and they allowed Chinese merchants to exploit the local people. The result of that was that in the 19th century, there were a whole series of rebellions in Xinjiang, one after another. The major one occurred in 1862 and lasted for 15 years, till 1877. It took a tremendous effort on the part of the dynasty to crush this rebellion, to suppress it, and bring it under control. After that, no major problems. Relations improved till 1911 when the dynasty collapsed, the Chinese dynasty collapsed. Actually, it was a Manchu dynasty, it wasn't Chinese. It was ruled by Manchurians. China collapsed in 1911. It broke up, and there was no real central government that was effective. In Xinjiang, a Chinese warlord took power and ruled from 1911 to 28. He recognized that you needed to have good relations with the Muslim community because 90% of the population was non-Han, non-Chinese. So he allowed the practice of Islam, he allowed pilgrimage sites to be set up. He did not engage in any severe laws against the Islamic community. He still profited enormously. He was still corrupt in general and still antagonized a lot of Chinese, so that in 1928, he was assassinated. From that point on, there has been one or another difficult relationship between the Chinese and the mostly Islamic community in Xinjiang. The Hui, who are ethnic Chinese, there's not the same problems. They're scattered throughout China. They're not found in one particular province. So there's no constituency for rebellion or for breaking away from China. They are Chinese. They don't want to break away from China. And so they've been allowed throughout the 20th century, even in the communist period, to undertake the responsibilities and tasks of good Muslims. There have been periods of when there have been problems where the Chinese government suppressed the Hui during the so-called Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76, a hardline period in China. But by and large, the Hui have not been treated in the same way as the Uyghurs. That was not supposed to be the way it is. When Mao Zedong took power in October of 1949, he articulated what he called a national minorities policy. The idea was that there'd be no discrimination against the cultures, the religions of non-Han people, non-ethnically Chinese people. They would be allowed to practice their own culture. They would be allowed their own language. There'd be no effort to change that. The underlying assumption that he had was that intermarriage would occur. Chinese Han people began in the 1950s reaching Xinjiang. In some cases, they were pushed by the government to reach that area. So that at the time before before Mao began that policy, Xinjiang was 90% Uyghur or Turkic groups. It's now 50-50. It's now 50% Han, 50% non-Han. that in-migration has been one of the points of tension between the Chinese and the Uyghur community, the Kazakh community, and others in China. But in the beginning, 1949 to 1958, Mao abided by his promise. There wasn't any sort of discrimination against the local community. The only change was that something called the Production and Construction Corps. The Production and Construction Corps, which was made up primarily of military people, was set up in Xinjiang and did a lot of the major economic construction that occurred, a lot of the major elements of growth, which Mao felt was needed. And it needed a lot. We know we're very lucky that in 1948, one of the most important China experts, a man named Doak Barnett, was then a reporter. He'd been brought up in China. He was the son of YMCA people in China, came back to the United States for his college, eventually became professor of government at Columbia, and then came down here and was with the Brookings Institution, was very much involved in restoring relations with China in the 1970s, a major figure. As a kid, I think he was about 28 years old, he went all over China. And he wrote a book called China on the Eve of Communist Takeover. You read that book, and about 20% of it deals with Xinjiang. He was very depressed about what was going on there. He called Xinjiang University a joke, that it didn't really exist. He was distressed by the fact that there was not economic development. He was distressed by the fact that there was a hierarchy of begs, B-E-G-S, who dominated and who controlled most of the wealth of the province. So things were not great in Xinjiang at that point in the pre-communist period. And so the communists were determined to promote economic growth and to take advantage of the tremendous mineral and natural resources of Xinjiang. That was critical. And they felt that if they adopted a kind of moderate policy from 49 to 58, that there'd be more intermarriages and that there'd be greater assimilation of the Uyghur community. It didn't happen. Most Uyghurs did not want to marry Han. The rate of intermarriage was very, very low. And in order to sort of satisfy the local people that there was not a draconian, harsh, repressive regime that was going to be in charge, Mao and his cohorts said in 1955 that Xinjiang would be an autonomous region. They called Xinjiang the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, supposedly giving greater authority and greater power to the Uyghurs. Whether that's true or not is something to think about. There was not much power granted to the Uyghur community. In 58, for reasons that I won't go into, that people thought Mao had gone mad and so on, and I don't think that's true. I think he had rational reasons for initiating a very harsh repressive policy called the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 62, abandoning private property and land, pushing people into communes, for, and everybody, not just the Chinese, but the Uyghurs. Uyghurs and Kazakhs were not happy. And in 62, about 60,000 of them fled to the Soviet Union right across the border. It was a harsh period. Nobody was killed as there would be in the Cultural Revolution, but there were people in prison, Uyghurs in prison, anybody demonstrating too much adherence to religion was also not particularly favored. That ends. It's a disaster. The economy founders as a result of these policies, and for 4 years, they returned to a more moderate policy regarding religion, regarding the Uyghurs. 66 to 76, the Cultural Revolution. Again, a repressive period, a period of squelching mosques, and some claiming that some Muslims claiming they were forced to eat pork, all sorts of impediments to proper practice of their religion. Eventually, in September of 76, Mao dies. And nobody knew what would happen. And everybody turned out to be wrong. I was at that point in Cleveland as professor at Case Western Reserve. And the day after he died, they brought a camera for the local newspaper, and they placed me in front of my bookcase, and they placed me actually in front of Arabic books, not Chinese. So it was a total flop. And the guy interviewed me about Mao Zedong and said, what do you think will, at the very end, he says, what do you think will happen? Well, stupidly, I try not to speculate, but on this, I did. I was too full of myself. And I said, well, Mao Zedong has died, and after a few months, the Gang of Four will take over, his wife and 3 other people. Gang of Four was in jail in a couple of months, and I turned out to be dead wrong. The people who came to power were moderates who wanted to change the policies of the Cultural Revolution. And in terms of Xinjiang, one of the top people, a man named Hu Yaobang, visited Xinjiang and said, first of all, we need more Communist Party members from the local community, that is, leaders, cadre, to give them greater authority over themselves. Secondly, we go back to the old policy of not interfering with the practice of Islam and not interfering with their culture. That was a much sounder policy, obviously, than the policy of the Cultural Revolution. But they too counted on the idea of greater assimilation, greater contact between Han and Uyghur, and greater intermarriage. In addition, the other underlying assumption they made was that economic growth, if there was economic growth in Xinjiang, that some of the tensions between the Chinese and the Uyghurs would disappear. For a while it worked, the 1980s. And then starting in the 1990s, there were tensions erupted. Some of the Uyghurs felt that they were getting the lousiest jobs in the economy. They felt that they were being discriminated against in terms of work and employment. Chinese responded by saying, Chinese government responded by saying, okay, we're going to start affirmative action for you, both in the economy and in schools. We're going to favor you in a variety of ways. And that has been kind of pursued. More Uyghurs go to university than was the case during the period prior to the 1990s. It didn't work in certain ways. Tensions continued to erupt between some Uyghurs, and not all Uyghurs were anti-Chinese. There are quite a few Uyghurs who have done very well in the Chinese-dominated economy. I've met them in Xinjiang, people who live extraordinarily well and would not have lived as well without Chinese investment. There's no question that some people have done very well, some Uyghurs, and in addition, there's no question that there has been economic development, which has led to a longer lifespan for Uyghurs, just as there's been a longer lifespan for the Han. There's also been better building for both the Uyghur community and the Han community in various cities in Xinjiang. A big effort was made in 2009 to improve the buildings in Xinjiang, and they raised some of the old buildings and put up modern buildings with air conditioning and with all this stuff, washing machines and everything. They were criticized for that. The government was criticized for that. I think that was an unfair criticism. They were criticized for undermining the traditional housing of the Uyghurs. Well, some of the traditional housing of the Uyghurs was not particularly good, and they were being moved to a better situation. So I think in some ways there's an unfairness to this. What happened, what has created the present crisis is a number of violent incidents in the period since Xi Jinping took power. The new leader of China took power in 2012 and was an unknown figure at that point. I mean, his father had been an influential in the early days of communism, but had lost out, had been defeated, and Xi Jinping had been brought up in a rural area, somewhat poverty-stricken, lived in a cave for a while. So it's unclear what policies he would pursue. What happened within the space of a couple of years was incredible assassinations and bombings. Let me just give you a couple of these. In 2014, the imam of the largest mosque in Kashgar was assassinated because he wanted to work to collaborate with the Chinese. 31 people were knifed to death in a province in southwest China, which had nothing to do with the Uyghurs, a place called Yunnan by a Uyghur group in the Yunnan railroad station. A bomb in Thailand. The Uyghurs were upset that some Uyghurs who had sought asylum in Thailand were returned to China. So a bomb was set up in a temple, a Buddhist temple in Thailand, which killed about 20 people. 50 people were killed in a mine in part of Xinjiang, and so on. And then on top of that, a car bomb was set in the main square in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square, a major site in the country. And Xi Jinping lives in Tiananmen. Xi Jinping thought that Islam had been behind this, that the Islamic religion was the main threat, and that Islamic so-called splitists, people who wanted to break away from China, who wanted Xinjiang to be completely independent and not part of China, were responsible. He claimed that also, and some evidence, that some of them got their weapons from Afghanistan and from a couple, not very many, had worked with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Not a tremendous number, but the fact that they were found there it was attested to what he believed. And so they came up with what I think is a disastrous policy. And that is to re-educate the Islamic community, to bring them to camps, and on the pretext that they were being taught Chinese language so that they could be qualified for better jobs in China. And secondly, that they would be given the skills to apply for those jobs, engineering skills or construction skills or whatever that they didn't have. But beyond that, there was also a heavy dose of ideology. Xi Jinping thought. I think this has been a PR nightmare for the Chinese, for the Chinese communists. They've been criticized for this. I think the criticism has gone too far. The terminology that's used should not be used. It's not genocide. They're not killing people left and right. It's not a concentration camp. And so I think that undermines the message that you get, that you want to spread. Probably our greatest ambassador to China, J. Stapleton Roy, who was ambassador some years ago, again, born in China. I wish we had everybody in the establishment in the State Department who deals with China were born in China, because they've been the best in terms of, from my point of view, come up with the best solutions. His brother was David Roy, was professor of Chinese literature at the University of Chicago and translated some of the great Chinese novels. So they're very well informed. Roy thinks it's a mistake to call this genocide and to call this call these operations because people don't believe that, and the Chinese can respond and say, this is ludicrous, we're not killing anybody, and they can respond again by saying, you know, we're trying to assimilate the population just as you in the United States assimilated the various peoples who came to the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. You didn't do a great job either. And they can also point, what they've done is point to the African-American community that did not have a great time in assimilating in the United States. They are very much aware of some of the scandals in the United States. Just the other day, there was an article in the New York Times about a juvenile justice facility in Louisiana, where the children were terribly sexually exploited, mostly blacks. And so it's hard to, really make a strong case against them. And it's harder to make a strong case if you use terminology that's not accurate. And I think that's what Roy, Stapleton Roy, is getting at. There are things that are not great. They're using facial recognition. They're accused of in these camps of using torture. There's no specific evidence of that. We don't know. We don't have reams of documentation about that. There's there's accusations of sterilization of women, of Uyghur women, of forced abortions of Uyghur women. We don't know. It's a very touchy issue because in 1980, there was a guy named Steve Mosher, an anthropologist, who, again, when the Chinese adopted a one child per family system, you can only have one child in the cities. He claimed that there was a lot of sterilization, forced abortion. There probably were some. There's no question about it. But if the Chinese had not started a policy of one child per family, if you follow the demographic trends, 1953, there were 650 million Chinese. They doubled by 1980, was 1,300 million. If there was no birth control policy, there would now be 3 billion Chinese in the world. And so it's a tough choice. I think they made a terrible mistake in 1953 in not starting on birth control policies, voluntary. They ignored that up until 80. So, when you talk about sterilization, who knows? There probably are excesses. I think I was commissioned by a foundation to come up with recommendations about what the United States should do in terms of Xinjiang and the Uyghur community. I think it's going to be very hard to do anything, because anything that we criticize them, they come right back at us. If we criticize them about how they treat minorities, they're going to say, well, how do you treat minorities? How have you treated Native Americans? How have you treated African Americans? They're not going to take that. And I think if we persist in the present policy, where 80% of the population now, because of propaganda, because of whatever has been done, is hostile to China, I don't think that's great. And we're now, I think, a less hostile relationship would win points in China and would allow the people who do believe that the Uyghurs should have opportunities to express their culture, that they should have opportunities to express their religious beliefs, would emerge. There are people like that, I've met them, in Chinese who do believe that. But they are put on the defensive when the United States adopts a hostile policy. They're accused of being pro-American and anti-Chinese. So it doesn't, I think in terms of practical policies, what I suggested to the foundation was that let's keep it cool. Let's not talk about genocide. Let's not talk about concentration camps. Let's deal with the Chinese and encourage a more progressive thought. But you can't encourage more progressive thought if you continue the hostilities. Let me end with one last aspect of this, which I found unfortunate. I met with government officials a few weeks ago about Mongolia, as it happens. I'm very interested in Mongolia. We are now, at this very moment, having a joint military exercise with Mongolia right on the Chinese border, irritating the Chinese tremendously. Why do we need to do that? We're not going to go to war if they attack Mongolia. They're not planning to attack Mongolia. I pointed that out, and I said, what's the point? They say, well, the Mongols like it. Is that the basis of American foreign policy? Just because the Mongols like it and a few Mongols like it. So we got to be more strategic, less hostile, seems to me, to the rest of the communist world, China in particular. We need China, and we need China to be peaceful. We need China to be tolerant of its minorities and work out a better system of working with the minorities instead of putting them into re-education and retraining camps. Okay, let me stop here, and if you have questions or comments, I'd be glad to take them. See this wonderful music that the Uyghurs have, wonderful dancing. It's just very difficult for them to express themselves at the moment. I wish there hadn't been these violent incidents that the Chinese can take advantage of to claim that Islam precipitated these violent incidents. And therefore, everything about Uyghur culture is harm. These are Kazakhs here. It's another group. They're mostly pastoral people. They live in the countryside. They are involved in animal husbandry, and they don't have the same attachment to the Islamic religion, perhaps, as the Uyghurs do. And so they're not regarded as particularly dangerous to the state. Here's a whole bunch of different minorities. It's mostly Islamic minorities in Xinjiang. Okay. This mosque in Kashgar with 10,000 worshipers, they allow it to take place. I think they view it as a way to ingratiate themselves with the rest of the Islamic world and with the local Islamic community. I've seen not 10,000, but I've seen quite a few people being allowed to pray at the mosque. They also publicized the fact that in 2015, the leader of the mosque, the religious leader of the mosque, was assassinated by Uyghur terrorists, what they call terrorists. These are pilgrimage sites that are no longer easily visited by the Muslim community. It's just the Chinese think that having groups visit these pilgrimage sites create tensions and greater hostility. So some of them have been abandoned, and some of them quite beautiful. This one is not as beautiful as some of the others. And the Chinese are seriously, in 2015, let me give you a quote from the AP. There were so many bombings and assassinations. The latest attacks have left Urumqi's ethnic Han Chinese on edge about their Muslim neighbors. At a convenience store on a street near the vegetable market, the operator spoke of heightened alert whenever a Uyghur steps in. If it's a Uyghur man, we follow him in the store in case he could place something here, like an explosive. That comes from the Associated Press, to reporters, the Associated Press. So it's, what can we do? What, I don't know, puzzled. I think the only thing I can think of is our policy ought to change and be less hostile to China. I think that would make a big difference. And here, stop ethnic cleansing. That's people outside of Uyghurs outside of the country who are worried about Uyghur culture being eroded and undermined.
Is this claim true? Mosques are demolished.
Excuse me?
Mosques are demolished. Is this claim true? You didn't mention it about mosques.
The mosques are demolished or turned into. There are some mosques that have been closed, but in 2016, I saw in Kashgar a totally built, gigantic mosque built by a very wealthy Muslim. There was no one there, but it was huge. But some, obviously, they have devastated, destroyed some mosques. They say that in some places economic growth has led to, the fact that they have to move the mosque, or that not enough people have gone into use the mosque. It's hard to, hard to dispute in certain ways. I'm sure there's some of it is discrimination, sure. It's a needless, it's like, I was thinking about it of my own youth, being brought up as a Jew in Egypt. All my friends were Arab Muslims, all my childhood friends. I kept up with some of them. Why the current hostility, and now with Netanyahu in charge, it's going to be worse. Why the Jewish community doesn't just stand up? Don't want right-wing, ultra-right-wing people in charge of relations with the Arab world. It's like everything else. I mean, it's just so, it seems to me so simple. But we're stuck with this political stuff. What makes it difficult to operate properly. Yeah, did you have a comment?
Yes. What about the tensions between Hui people and Uyghurs?
And Uyghurs, yeah, there is. The Hui were kind of used in the Manchu period, in the 18th century and 19th century. They were used as guards in some of the Uyghur communities. And Hui continue to have sort of contradictory feelings about the Uyghurs. They don't want to break away from China. They want to practice their religion, but for the most part, they're allowed to. They're the ones who are allowed to go on the Hajj. They're the ones who are allowed to, have restaurants in Beijing and Canton that cater to halal food. So, and they think that the tensions of the government with the Uyghurs harms them. So they're not as happy with the Uyghurs as one would think. They're not unified. As religion doesn't bring them together. What can you do? Yeah, go ahead.
So there are some questions from
sure.
the Zoom, but
Yeah.
I just want to ask if there is anyone from the room to ask any questions, then we can move to the Zoom session.
Yeah, and then
So do you mind speaking a little louder for the people for the?
So my name is Ping and I'm a Chinese, but I will lecture of Arabic here. So I wanted to thank you for pointing out that the genocide is not like the Islam action. Oh, I just want to first thank you for pointing out that the genocide is not an accurate term to describe what is happening because it has set effects for us, for me, Chinese, whom I read, it's genocide, and also I think I wanted to ask for your opinion. I wanted to reflect U.S. policy about boycotting or censoring all the products that are produced in Xinjiang. Would this really help the Uyghurs? I mean, that's from my perspective. It actually gonna make the economy of Xinjiang worse because it's, for example, for the cottons that's produced in Xinjiang, if it was boycotted, it was censored. I mean, that's the major, one of the very important economic resources for the Uyghur community. It would actually harm the Uyghur community. How do we?
you mean the Han community or
The Uyghur community as well. The Uyghur community as
the Uyghur
well.
community?
Yeah.
It still exists. It's difficult to think that the Uyghurs are, genocide is being practiced against them. There's a book that just came out a couple of years ago, put out by Princeton Press, amazing. It was put out by Princeton Press by someone who doesn't know Chinese. It says it's a war against the Uyghurs. I don't think there's a war against the Uyghurs. I think there's tension and there's animosity on the part of some government to Uyghurs. But I don't think it's a war. I think to use that kind of terminology is the same thing as saying genocide and concentration camps. It evokes images which are not accurate and which make it difficult to come up with a solution. There are solutions. One of the leading minority specialists in China has come up with a brilliant solution. And that is, the Uyghurs are mostly in southern Xinjiang. In northern Xinjiang, it's mostly Han. He came up with the idea of making the autonomous region, the Uyghur region in the south, and making it really autonomous. Not totally independent, but local people running the show, not Han people. That's a pretty good alternative. Another alternative by a professor in California, actually Chinese descent. Why not take the money that you figure out that you're spending? I don't know how much he said. Let's say $20,000 a person keeping someone in an internment camp or re-education camp. Take that money, give it to the person to start a business, and having that, part of the economy I mean, being part of the economy will make them less violent and in fact more possibilities of good relations with the Han. I don't know, there are lots of possibilities, but if we keep on, using this terminology and talking about hostile aspects and about the wars with the Uyghurs and so on, we'll never come up with anything. There's a book by one of my former students, actually, which I just read, in which he talks about the terror of the Chinese in 1916, the terror plot of the Chinese, without mentioning these bombings, these assassinations that led up to those policies. So it's, it's a little bit of dishonest history. You've got to include everything, it seems to me. And some bad things that Uyghurs have done, some terrific things they've done, some terrible things the Chinese government has done, some good stuff. If we continue to look at things in black and white, particularly the American government looks at things in black and white, we'll never be able to resolve the issues. We have to come up with some creative solutions. This book that I wrote, I put in all of these proposals at the very end, all of these various scenarios that people have suggested that could work. Why not have convinced Chinese that, I think they could be convinced that, you put all the Uyghurs in one locale, they have their own leadership, they don't break away from China, but they maintain relations with China. There are possibilities, but if we keep on using terminology that is not accurate, we'll never come up with a solution.
Like you counted several attacks in 2000s, like you counted some attacks in 2000s, terrorist attacks, bomb attacks in Thailand, in Beijing.
2015.
Yeah, in 2000s, like several attacks you
Right.
mentioned. Why such kind of radicalization was triggered in 2000s, but not 90s, 80s, or during the era of the mall? Like generally the radicalization deals. Like why suddenly it erupted in 2000s, but not 80s, 90s? Like because radicalization research mainly deals with the Western Hemisphere and what leads to radicalization or how can we conflict against it, etc. But we have very little knowledge about the radicalization of Uyghurs in 2000s.
Okay.
What triggered?
Okay. There are two ways of looking at it. From the standpoint of the Uyghurs, too many Han coming in, too many Chinese moving in, and too many of them dominating the economy. So they were reacting to that. From the Chinese standpoint, here we're giving them affirmative action. We're trying to teach them Chinese so that they and provide them with skills so they can actually get decent jobs. We get their children better schools. We're setting up boarding schools that are better than the ones in St. John and having their kids go there. So it depends on which side. Both sides are wrong. Both sides are right in some ways. And 2000 in particular was a time period for reevaluation and arrival of more Chinese. More Chinese into St. John. And so that was part of the reaction. The Chinese would say also it's a reaction because so many of these Uyghurs went and got trained in Afghanistan or Pakistan and came back militants became back fundamentalists. You know, they're both.
As far as I know, those are areas of China, like where Uyghurs live, Xinjiang, etc. Those areas very underdeveloped place. Why there is a natural domestic migration flow towards there by the Han people? Why do they
Right in the north?
Yeah, from the Han regions to Xinjiang. Why they migrate to there?
Because there's big money to be made. Mineral resources, natural resources, there's oil, big petroleum reserve that's now being you know, made use of. Cotton. There's money to be made, and plus construction. The investment, the initial investment of China opened up to the rest of the world in the late 1970s, was all on the East Coast. That area became, you know, everything from hotels to factories to everything. Now, a lot of it is the West. They feel that one of the things they feel is that if they invest in the West, in places like Xinjiang, that would ameliorate some of the difficulties that existed in the past. And that's what they've done. I was amazed because I went to Xinjiang last time I was there was around 2000, 2001. And then I went back in 2016. Dramatic changes, roads, economic development as a whole, much greater population in some of the cities. The countryside has lost out, but the cities have grown. And they look like modern cities, which they did not 2000. So there's a lot of money to be made. The Chinese want to make it, the Han want to make it. Uyghurs want to make it too. And question is to make it a fair share for both sides.
Okay, I would like to address some questions
Sure.
coming from the Zoom. So the first one is from Hayun Ma. I want to thank Professor Rossabi for his excellent talk today. His name is Hayun Ma, and he's a graduated from Georgetown University, studied with John Wall and James Miller on Islam and China. And China. And he teaches now at Fraught State University in Maryland and focus on Islam and Muslims in China. And I have three questions. First one is about the historical Muslim-Chinese relationship. It seems to me the Han-Muslim relationship deteriorated during the Ming period or the 17th century, not during the Mongol rule of China. The reason seems related to Muslim migration from Hami-Turfan to cities in Confucian heartlands, as Confucian scholar Gu Yanwu clearly demonstrated in his work. Then, as a response to this kind of early Islamophobia, Muslim intellectuals began to talk about Islam in Confucian terms to demonstrate the orthodoxy of Islam and compatibility with the Confucianism. It's not simply a natural result of cultural synthesis, but a cultural response to political accusations and attacks. I think more of a comment.
Okay,
than a
all right,
question.
let me try the first two. Yeah, during the Ming, there were a couple of anti-Islamic regulations, and there was some tension, but it seems to me there's no question in my mind that the people like Ahmad, if he's listening, people like Ahmad, who became the finance minister under Kublai Khan and raised taxes enormously on the merchants and others, created a hostile environment for most Muslims in China. And you begin to get satires. What I've been interested in is stories that appear in the Mongol period that for the first time criticize Muslims, that criticize them for not abiding by the principles of not drinking alcohol, not abiding by principles regarding eating a pork and so on. So I think the UN, to my mind, it's the beginning of it. In the Ming Dynasty, there were still some Muslims who played important roles. Zheng He being the most famous, the navigator I mentioned, who led 7 naval expeditions. He was given a commission to do that by the state, and yet he was a Muslim. Sure, there were anti-Muslim attacks, but I was just trying to get at the beginnings of it. And the major development in terms of anti-Muslim feelings began in the 18th and 19th centuries with rebellions in Xinjiang. That's what I still believe. If he's interested, I'll send him a couple of articles separate. He can send them to me. And what was the second question?
Other question is from Kurban Niyaz. He says a very similar genocide happened 70 years ago, and many people have said that they didn't know about this happening. However, now we have enough evidence regarding the ongoing genocide in Xinjiang. And do you think that it can still be ignored again, like we did during World War II?
Which was the first one that he mentioned?
So he said, now do we have enough? We have enough evidence.
No, but which
Okay.
was the
Do you
real
think that it can still be ignored again, like we did during the World War II?
during World War II? I haven't seen any evidence of millions of people being gassed in Xinjiang. That's real genocide. I haven't seen, anything like that, and no one is claiming that. Even the people who claim torture, claim it's torture, but not death. So I think genocide should be reserved for wiping out a whole people. Don't think that's happening at the moment. And I think as I say, by using that terminology, you undercut any possibility of coming to a resolution.
Yeah, if you would like to unmute and ask, you can. Actually, I read the questions, and there's one follow-up question. So
Sure.
So based on your lecture, can we say, this is again from Kurban Niyaz, can we say the current ethnic policy of CCP is the zenith of assimilation attempts of the PRC?
Yeah, I think they would like it if there was considerable intermarriage and assimilation. That I think that was Mao Zedong's original policy hope. Doak Barnett, when he went back to Xinjiang after the opening up of China in the 1970s, said that he encountered quite a few Chinese who believed that there would be assimilation. He said that there will be intermarriage. He said that's very unlikely. Parents of young Uyghurs were not eager for them to have to intermarry with Han, and so I don't know if that will happen. Chinese may have a misguided view of it all. Yeah.
I'm coming from Germany. I'm also dealing with Muslim Christian relationships or Muslim Turkish organizations in Berlin or overall Europe. I'm working personally. I'm a master's student. And this is the same case in Germany now undergoing. Muslim parents do not allow their kids to get married, especially their daughters to get married. With the non-Muslims, European or other European ethnic groups, I don't know, it is out of religious law or other cultural norms, like racial cultural norms. We don't have any ethnographic in-depth research about it. Is there any research for intermarriages, like lack of intermarriages between Uyghur and Han people in China? Is there any specific research about it? You can pinpoint any ethnographic research.
Well, there certainly was intermarriage in the Han and the Manchus. So that the Manchus are now virtually gone. But in terms of, they aren't gone totally, but they've been reduced in terms of their numbers. It's hard to say. Inner Mongolia, you look at the same thing. Mao's policy was the same regarding Chinese and Mongols. And that has happened. There is a higher rate of intermarriage between the Han and the Mongols. I don't know what prevents the other, but that's just the way it is. The Chinese are making a great mistake, it seems to me. They think that there's going to be tremendous intermarriage between Han and Uyghurs. Just hasn't happened in almost 80 years. So I don't foresee a tremendous intermarriage possibility at the moment.
Between for German,
Yeah.
Yeah, another question from Zoom. This is this time from Nagla Hussein. Thank you, Dr. Rossabi, for your talk. My name is Nagla Hussein and I teach Arabic here at George Mason. I am wondering if there's any sort of support or advocacy for the Huya and Uyghur coming from any Middle Eastern countries stateside. I have not heard anything, but maybe even on a basic sort of accessing information, news outlets or community help. Yeah, she's wondering if there's any sort of support or advocacy for the Hui and Uyghur coming from any Middle Eastern countries.
From any Middle Eastern countries?
Yes.
Not as much as one would think. There are Uyghurs who moved to Turkey, the largest contingent of Uyghurs who've gone abroad, have been to Turkey, and they've been on occasion under pressure from the Chinese government to prevent the Uyghurs from demonstrating, from organizing demonstrations. There hasn't been a concerted effort from the Arabic world to play a role. Certainly Iran is so tied in with China that I don't foresee any sort of Iranian support for the Uyghurs or Hui. The Arab world, not so far. And partly because they haven't moved there. Most Uyghurs, refugees, have moved to Central Asia or Turkey. And the Central Asians are very bound up with China economically now. So it's very unlikely that they would challenge Chinese policy with regard to the Uyghurs and Hui or support the Uyghurs and Hui in any major way. China gets a lot of oil from Kazakhstan, gets gas from Turkmenistan. It invests in Tajikistan, it invests in some of these other places, and is steadily substituting for Russia in Central Asia. Greater economic ties between China and these areas. So I don't think there'll be tremendous support. I may be wrong, but I haven't seen it so far. And they have limited demonstrations. They have prevented Uyghurs from making a concerted effort in their countries. In terms of Pakistan and Afghanistan, that's a different issue. We don't know what will happen with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Who knows? Initially, the Chinese seemed interested in, when the Taliban emerged victorious last year, it seemed that the Chinese were interested in, particularly in mineral resources in Afghanistan, in working out a deal. But that has been slowed down, and I don't know what will happen in that regard. The Chinese still claim that a lot of weapons come in from Afghanistan, Pakistan to Sejong.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Rossabi, and thank everybody who joined us through Zoom and in person. And to see you hopefully in future events.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Let's hope I'm wrong. Thank you for inviting me.